There's been some really interesting data looking at like in the Philippines and Indonesia. Where else? I think New Orleans as well. They've looked at patients that have died and their vitamin D levels. And basically, like in the Philippines, people that for like every standard deviation increase in vitamin D levels, serum vitamin D levels, the people had like an 8% or were 8 times less likely to have a severe form of COVID-19. And they were 20 times less likely to have critical form of COVID-19.
Whoa.
So that was the Philippines. In the Indonesia was a really interesting study where like they measured vitamin D, and this was measured in the patients. There's been some vitamin D studies also where they're like looking at, countries that have been affected the worst, and they all like have low vitamin D, and it's like, okay, well, anyways, that's a correlation. But so is this, but it's a little stronger data. In Indonesia, patients that died, almost 100%, it was like 98 point something percent of patients that died with COVID-19 were vitamin D deficient. 4% of patients that died from COVID-19 were vitamin D sufficient, only 4% were vitamin D sufficient. So basically they were all vitamin D deficient, all the ones that are dying.
Whoa.
Crazy, right? Right now I'm taking 5,000 IUs a day. 70% of the U.S. population has insufficient vitamin D levels, which is considered less than blood levels less than 30 nanograms per milliliter. The problem is that we don't go outside anymore, and somewhere like 28% of the U.S. population is actually deficient, like less than 20 nanograms per mil. That's defined deficiency. So there's a lot of people in the United States. As you mentioned, you make it from the sun, so particularly UVB radiation. There's a reason why I want to talk about this. You make it from UVB radiation exposure. Basically, it's made in the skin, and but there's certain times of the year, depending on where you live, in a more northern latitude, where that UVB isn't even hitting the atmosphere. So you're not making vitamin D. Also, if you have darker skin, melanin protects you. Like the whole, people with darker skin, people from maybe Africa or India or South Asia, they're more equatorial regions. They're closer to the equator, and there's more UVB radiation throughout the year. And so as a protective mechanism to not get burned, you have melanin, which protects you, right? The problem is that melanin also blocks your ability to produce vitamin D. But if you're out in the sun all the time, in a place where you're getting UVB radiation, it's not a problem. What happens when you take a person from South Asia, from India, from Africa, and you put them in Sweden or in Minnesota or in the UK? A place where UVB radiation doesn't hit most of the year, and you don't give them a supplement. What happens is they become severely vitamin D deficient, severely. And what happens when you take? I mean, you can throw this you can flip this over and say, okay, what happens when you take the guy from the UK, the Brit, and put him in Australia? Like without any sunscreen or without a hat African Americans are in the United States. There's been studies. African Americans are severely deficient. They're 28 times more deficient in vitamin D than Caucasians.
Whoa.
Yeah, and it's because they have darker skin and they're not getting enough sun because people stay inside more. People stay inside. It's not like the old days when we were out hunter-gatherer and out in the sun all the time. We're inside all the time. We're in school, we're at work, in our office, in our cubicle. So the CDC, obviously there's been studies showing that African Americans are more hit, but they didn't really correct for tons of other factors, because socioeconomic status is important, other health factors, but there was a big study just released not long ago from the National Office of Statistics in Britain or something like that. I don't know what their official name was, but they released some statistics from England and Wales, and I don't know what the correct name to say. I mean, the blacks there basically living in England and in Wales are 4 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than whites. When they adjusted all that data for socioeconomic status and for other health factors, they were 2 times more likely to die. So clearly socioeconomic status and other health factors are playing a role, but there's something else unidentified. And I think it's vitamin D. I think that, the vitamin D, I'm not saying that vitamin D is going to prevent you from getting COVID-19 or it's a treatment, although I am involved in a clinical study where we're going to be testing a very small open-arm study we can talk about. But, I'm not a physician. I'm a medical doctor. I've never intubated anyone. So don't think I'm saying that. I don't want people to think I'm saying it's a treatment. I just want to, it's a hypothesis that needs to be tested. And thankfully, there are clinical trials, randomized controlled trials that are now ongoing, and there are some that are recruiting. In Sweden, there's a huge population of Somalis that have migrated to Sweden, and they have been identified as being severely vitamin D deficient because a lot of the Somalis they're also like autism rates are really high there, and there's this link between, I published a link also between vitamin D and autism. But so there's been studies looking at vitamin D levels in the Somali population. I mean, they are so deficient because you're taking someone who's evolved to be getting a lot of sun, but not burn from it, and then putting them in a place where they can't get any vitamin D from the sun. And if they don't get a supplement, like, they're going to be deficient. Wow. And they're so much more likely. They're like, it's wreaking havoc in Sweden on the Somali population. Obese people are like 3 times more likely to be vitamin D deficient in the United States because vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, and it's been shown to be 50% less bioavailable. So you have to, after you make it in your skin, it's stored in fat, and it's released when basically into the bloodstream, and then it gets converted into a hormone. This hormone regulates 5%, more than 5% of the human protein-encoded human genome. It's a lot of it's a hormone. Like, can you imagine just walking around without testosterone? You're a man. That's a hormone. I mean, because there's a lot of people that are deficient in vitamin D, and it's a steroid hormone. It gets converted into a hormone. It's important. It's really important. So I went off on a tangent, but anyways, there's vitamin D receptors on like your immune cells, and the reason for that is because when the vitamin D hormone binds to the receptor, it activates all these genes, and that the genes do stuff that are, regulate immune function. There's studies that have shown people, and I love these studies because they basically take away people's complaints about, there's lots of epidemiological studies showing that low vitamin D is associated with disease X, Y, or Z. And everyone's like, well, they're not in the sun as much, so they're not as healthy, they're not as physically active, they're not whatever, even though those confounding factors are usually corrected for. It's all, at the end of the day, it's an association, right? And everyone's like, correlation's not causation, which is true. But sometimes you got to look at the full body of data, There are genetic polymorphisms. So there are people that have variations in genes that cause them to genetically have lower vitamin D. And so this is called Mendelian randomization, when you can take a person that has a genetically, they're genetically low vitamin D. So you're not categorizing them based on their vitamin D levels. You're categorizing them based on their gene. And those people are more likely to die from respiratory infections, just based on that gene alone. So, wow. Yeah, that gene that it's known to it leads to lower vitamin D levels. And so those people are more likely to die from respiratory infections than people that don't have that, which it's a great way of kind of randomizing people by their genes as opposed to doing a randomized controlled trial. Those have been done as well. There was a study that was over 25 randomized controlled trials. People that were given a vitamin D supplement, varying doses, either weekly or daily. Monthly didn't work. The people with low baseline vitamin D levels, so people that were deficient, they were 50% less likely to have a respiratory tract infection if they were taking the vitamin D supplement. Over 50%, actually. And people that had already normal levels still had a protective effect. They were 10% less likely. So even people that were already considered normal, taking a vitamin D supplement helped prevent the respiratory tract. So the tolerable upper intake has been set by the Nutrition Board, the Institute of Medicine, to be 4,000 IUs a day. But there's been studies that have shown that people that have taken 10,000 IUs a day for multiple years haven't had any hypercalcemia or had problems. But too much vitamin D can be toxic. It's not good to take that. It's best to get a vitamin D blood test, and I think that personally there has been a trend. So people that have blood levels higher than 60 may have just a little bit higher calcium level, but not much. It's not anything to be hugely concerned about. But there are studies also showing that either vitamin K1, so there's been a meta-analysis looking at 12 different studies, I think, where vitamin K1 or vitamin K2 were given, and both of those improved bone mineral density and prevented any hypercalcemia. Because when you take vitamin D, you absorb calcium better, like something crazy, like 40% more dietary calcium is being absorbed.
Wow.
So the problem is that calcium can easily form a precipitate in general, and particularly when phosphorus is around. And phosphorus is another thing vitamin D does increase the absorption of. But again, like I said, it's really hard to find any studies where vitamin D is causing, hypercalcemia unless it's like really, really high dose for a while. I personally think taking the vitamin K, and what's interesting about the vitamin K1 versus vitamin K2, without going into too much of a tangent, is basically the vitamin K1. Normally it goes to your liver and it's involved in blood coagulation, but when there's enough vitamin K1 around, it stays in the periphery and it moves calcium, periphery being bloodstream, it moves calcium out of the bloodstream and takes it to places where it's supposed to go, like the bones and the muscle. Vitamin K2 usually stays around the periphery, doesn't really go to the liver, so that's usually what it's just doing is, moving calcium out and bringing it to the bones. And so I actually have K1 in my multi that I take, but I also take a K2 supplement, MK4. I take it like a couple times a week. Well, the K1's in my multi, so vitamin K1 is it's found in dark leafy greens, so I get a lot of those as well. I get a lot, so I'm getting a lot of K1. Vitamin K2 is not as readily found in like the Western. I mean, it's like the food that's highest in it is that fermented soybean natto, but it's like small quantities. And like there's a big reason I think that vitamin D is so important. It's for the lung function and the respiratory function. But what's really interesting is that, the very receptor that this SARS-CoV-2 virus binds to gain entry into the cell, it's called ACE2. That very receptor plays a really important role in preventing lung damage and basically preventing acute lung injury, preventing acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS. And what's been shown with SARS-CoV-1 is that, because SARS-CoV-1 also binds to that receptor, ACE2 it's called, and that's how it gets into the cell, just like the SARS-CoV-2. When it binds to the receptor, it attaches in through this weird endocytosis mechanism. It takes the receptor in and decreases the receptor, what's called downregulates the receptor, so you end up having less ACE2, which causes can cause severe lung injury. Not having the ACE2, it plays a big role in protecting. That's been shown in multiple studies. So the SARS-CoV-1 virus does that. It's thought the SARS-CoV-2 also does it because it enters through the same receptor. And it's been shown that, if you give mice lipopolysaccharide or something that's going to cause lung injury, and then you give them vitamin D, so the lung injury itself also causes the ACE2 receptor to decrease. And it's like this vicious cycle of making the damage worse. But if you give mice vitamin D before that happens, the ACE2 receptor increases and it protects them from the lung injury.
Whoa.
But you give the vitamin D to control mice that don't have the lung injury, it doesn't do anything to the ACE2 receptor levels. So it's not full stop. It's not drugs. The way drugs are designed is they target a certain molecule and they do their thing. They either increase it or decrease it. A lot of times with hormones, vitamins, things like that, they maintain homeostasis. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So when shit goes wrong, they fix it. They're not just boom, full stop, gonna increase something when everything's normal. So, and that's important because there have been some concern about taking vitamin D, increasing the ACE2 receptor. And there's another study that was with hypertensive rats where the hypertension caused ACE2 to go down, and that makes it makes all sorts of problems. It also causes kidney problems and all sorts of things, right? But the vitamin D increased the ACE2, but only in the hypertensive rats, not in the normal control rats. Again,
oh.
So, and then there was another study that was some other messed up diabetic animal model where the vitamin D actually didn't increase the ACE2 receptor, but it increased what's called soluble ACE2, which is it's in the periphery, and that actually potentially could bind SARS-CoV-2 virus and prevent it from, it's sequestering it, preventing it from entering the cell. That's actually being explored as a potential therapeutic. So the bottom line here is that sometimes you'll hear this ACE2 receptor, and that's how the virus gets in. And it's like, oh, I don't want that. I want less of that because that's how the virus gets in. But like biology is always way more complicated than just a simple taking it out of a big picture, right? So like the ACE2 receptor, the ACE2, is part of the renin-angiotensin system. It plays a huge role in inflammation. It's also like when you decrease ACE2, all these signaling cascades happen, and it's like ACE2 is important for producing pro-inflammatory cytokines at the end of the day without getting into all the stuff, specifics. So it causes massive inflammation to have a decrease. It basically causes acute lung injury. It exacerbates it. I mean, it's crazy. So I really, can you imagine if vitamin D really did help? Like, if there was something that could be given along with the other stuff, remdesivir, whatever it's going to be, the stuff that we identify. But like, vitamin D it's so cheap, it's so easy, and so many people are deficient and insufficient. So yes, as you mentioned, there is, you don't want to take too much vitamin D. You don't want to overdose on it. But I think in the short term, particularly like in the short term, and particularly in people that have already been infected, it may be wise to try giving your patient, like if you're a physician, dealing with this, it may be wise to try and see their vitamin D levels and perhaps give them some.